Thanks for coming along tonight. It's a big crowd here, so you're all very close, so you've got to be friendly, and we're away. So Senator Andrew Bragg makes a welcome return to the Sydney Institute. I think it's about his third occasion here, talking on housing. I'll introduce him briefly because he's well known. Senator for New South Wales since 2019. He's an author, he's an accountant, worked with the Financial Services Council, with the Business Council of Australia, and of course, as I mentioned, an author, I think, of 3 books. Is that right? And currently, of course, the Shadow Assistant Minister for Home Ownership, which is a recent appointment. And we're happy to have him here talking on the important topic of the housing crisis, the Coalition's approach. Senator Bragg, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerard. Thanks very much, Gerard. It's great to be back at the Institute, and can I thank you and Anne and the board of the Sydney Institute for providing us with this great clearinghouse, an opportunity for us to come together and have a discussion about ideas. I think we're living in an age where so much of the long-form, serious journalism has been hollowed out, so the opportunity you provide us here to give a proper speech and have a debate is critical. So tonight I want to talk about home ownership, and I want to start with philosophy. And that is that we believe in home ownership. And when it comes to our starting point as Liberals, it's that all Australians should have an opportunity to own their own house. And this is the Australian dream. As Robert Menzies said, and I quote, "One of the best instincts in us is that one which induces us to have one little piece of earth with a house and a garden which is ours." Millennials and Gen Zs were raised to believe, as were all post-war generations, that if they work hard and save, they will be able to own their own house. But currently we find ourselves in a situation where this is not going to materialise. Australians who have entered the workforce in the past 2 decades have done everything right. They have worked hard, they've worked for that little piece of earth that should be their own. They've worked for the Australian dream. But the dream is increasingly out of reach. I would say that the dream is turning into a nightmare and the future looks bleak. The country is failing a generation of young people and is locking in a poor outcome because of the following key structural factors. Not enough houses have been built, planning and zoning laws have wrecked development, and private developers have been demonised and penalised. Construction is at record lows. Labor is running the biggest migration program since the 1950s, and deposits are unobtainable. The combination of HECS debt, 11% super, interest rate hikes, cost of living pressures, and housing prices growth has meant that young people have to scale a record high mountain to get a decent deposit. A home loan is becoming unobtainable for the typical worker. And finally, and perhaps most critically, Labor has prioritised corporate home ownership over individual ownership. What follows are perhaps the most compelling 3 stats. The first is the cost of a house relative to a cost just a generation ago. In the year 2000, here in Sydney, the median house price was $287,000, or 5.7 times the average household income of $50,000. According to 2024 data, the median house price in Greater Sydney is now 11.7 times the average household income, more than double over that period. The second key data point is the length of time needed to achieve a deposit of 20%. And ANZ say that is now 11.1 years nationally, and in Sydney, it's a whopping 15.6 years. The third is the percentage of first home buyers entering the market. The ABS said in 2020 it was 23%, and that's now declined under Labor to just 19% in 2023. Unfortunately, there is no silver bullet. The solution is messy and complex, but in short, we need to stimulate construction, build a lot more homes, and find a way to tilt the scales in favour of first home buyers. Younger people are frustrated with politics, frustrated with the system, and in some cases considering extreme solutions. which will not work. It feels like the system is rigged, and it is. Westpac research shows that the fall in home ownership rates amongst younger age groups has been sharp. In 1960, 60% of those aged 25 to 34 owned a house, but this was fallen to just 45% in the 2020s. This is the biggest issue for people under 40. JWS research shows that it is the number one issue for people between 18 and 34 years of age. And one of the consequences of this is that many young people now resent the free market. As the British author Douglas Murray has said, and I quote, "It's not clear why people who don't have any ability to accumulate capital will love capitalism. It is clear to me why, if you don't think you will ever have a chance of owning a flat or an apartment, you might find an ideology which claims that it can solve every inequity on earth has an appeal," end quote. Sadly, Australia is becoming a nation where your parents' wealth determines your likelihood of housing success. And a recent Westpac survey found that 60% of new home buyers were going to rely on the bank of mum and dad, now one of the biggest lenders in the country. In giving up on individual ownership, Labor has adopted what I call a corporate housing policy. And in doing so, Labor will subsidise foreign fund managers and local institutions to construct and rent houses to Australians. Young people will become serfs to foreign fund managers or to local super funds. The Housing Australia Future Fund is one of Labor's main policies to lock in institutional advantage. As part of the HAF, the government has committed $350 million in availability payments to institutional investors. The administration of these payments is totally opaque, and I fear that taxpayers will end up feathering the nests of institutions. Another Labor idea is tax breaks for foreign investors in the build-to-rent sector. In the 2023-2024 budget, the government committed to halving the Managed Investment Trust withholding tax rate for build-to-rent developments from 30 to 15%. It will also increase the capital works deduction or depreciation rate available for these developments by 4%. The new tax cut for corporate housing to buildings of more than 50 dwellings, and Treasury says this will cost $30 million. This is no accident. This is the formalisation of a housing policy for corporations and foreign investors, not for people. I fear that the government is about to double down on this corporate housing policy by locking in additional tax incentives for institutions. A preview of this approach can be found in Alan Kohler's recent quarterly essay, The Great Divide. Kohler describes the effect of subsidising institutional investors for policies like build to rent as follows, and I quote, "All that will do is offset the tax advantage that individual owners get from negative gearing and capital gains tax, which is unavailable to institutions and is the reason Australia doesn't do build to rent, since tax advantaged individuals outbid institutions." The poor old institutions. Do they really need another leg up, another tax cut in addition to the HAF's availability payments? Housing Minister Collins now has a blueprint to lock in corporate ownership. The National Housing Supply and Affordability Council report she commissioned, titled Barriers to Institutional Investment, was the first order of business given to the council, the number one priority, number one. The report explicitly and enthusiastically states, and I quote, "Institutional investment in housing typically refers to equity finance invested by institutional investors in a collection of related dwellings to provide rental services at scale. It stands in contrast to the single dwelling provided by the individual landlord," end quote. The blueprint provides 11 recommendations to permanently change the foundation and character of Australia's housing system. Labor clearly believes that the major super funds and foreign fund managers are the only solution to the housing crisis. Where does this leave the Australian dream? It squeezes it out and puts it on a path to extinction. The corporate housing policy is lazy thinking and simply rewards the government's favoured vested interests. More could have been done to understand and respond to the very concerning data from Barrenjoey analyst Jonathan Mott. Mott says that since the pandemic, twice as many owner-occupied mortgages have been written to households with incomes of more than $200,000 compared to households with income below $100,000. Meanwhile, CoreLogic says a salary of more than $280,000 is needed to purchase Sydney's median house of $1.4 million. Labor is silent on this. This is something that the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, or APRA, should be looking at. Indeed, it was revealed recently in analysis by the loan market that the government's income caps on their Help to Buy scheme will fall significantly short of the price cap set for Melbourne and Sydney. Low and middle income families will find it increasingly impossible to obtain the required mortgage required to cover the difference as part of that scheme. This is another Labor boondoggle that ignores reality. The government should be gearing policy settings which enable institutions to better serve consumers, not letting them own the whole shop. But Labor seems clueless on housing and clueless on financial services. Last year, the CEO of ANZ, Shane Elliott, said, and I quote, "If you want a loan, you have to be better off and essentially rich." There is a cost of regulation which impacts lending. That's why Labor should be asking APRA to report on the real cost of regulation for first home buyers. Other prudential regulators, like the Monetary Authority of Singapore, must consider the impact of capital adequacy provisions on the economy, but APRA does not. We can have banks which are both unquestionably strong but also able to lend to first home buyers. Although APRA's approach to bank capital arrangements have resulted in reduced risk, they've also contributed to less growth and fewer first home buyers. In the last Parliament, the Coalition sought to reduce the cost of lending regulations because we understand the deadweight cost of duplicated laws. Getting institutions to better serve aspiration could form part of the alternative to Labor's corporatist approach. This will be challenging policy terrain as we consider the various capital adequacy and responsible lending laws, but we must try. If the average working Australian is going to lose access to a mortgage to fund their family home, we will cement the generational divide. Whilst other parties have given up on home ownership, the Coalition has always maintained that the aspiration of home ownership was a core part of the Australian ethos. Individuals, not institutions. We care about home ownership because it gives people the best foundation for life. It's been a feature of our liberalism, Australian liberalism, since the 1940s. Menzies put it at the centre of his policy offering. He said in 1953, quote, "The government therefore believes in home ownership. It is opposed to governments, either federal or state, becoming by degrees universal landlords. It does not believe that is a function of governments," end quote. Menzies got it. He understood the economic and social benefits of home ownership. In many respects, he was the founding father of the Australian dream. His statements on individual home ownership were a major contrast from the nationalised banking and housing systems sought by the Chifley Labor government. Had Chifley's plan prevailed, there would never have been a private post-war housing boom. Menzies was able to bring about this boom at a time when there was a lack of housing supply and record high migration intake. According to the ABS, at the end of the Chifley government, net overseas migration was 140,000 in 1949, but only 57,000 dwellings were completed in 1949-50. This was roughly one new dwelling for every 2.6 migrants. In other words, we have seen this film before. By the end of the Menzies government, dwelling completion had risen to 113,000 by 65-66, with net migration stabilising at 112,000 in 1965. Jumping to 1982, Malcolm Fraser said of Menzies' housing policy, quote, "Today, almost 72% of Australian households own or are buying their own home, compared to just 50% in the late 1940s. So, addressing this issue will be at the core of our offering. come next year's election. It is shaping up as the housing election, and there will be three very clear choices for the Australian people. Now, turning to Labor's record, it is clear that after 2 years, Labor has given up on home ownership. Younger Australians now face higher interest rates, lower building approval rates, higher construction costs, higher immigration, and a government obsessed with institutions and not focused on individuals. Perhaps worst of all, Labor's supply policy is in tatters. Its promise to build 1.2 million new homes has been savaged here in Sydney by the Minns government. Premier Minns has declared that it will be extremely difficult for New South Wales to meet its portion of the target because of delays to construction and labour shortages. The Labor government is too distracted by vested interests to deliver any serious policies to address interest rates, increase building approval rates, lower construction costs, and to steady immigration. The ABS data shows the building approvals have dropped to just 12,500 for the month of February. To put this into context, you'd need to have 20,000 homes a month to meet the 1.2 million target. Construction costs are very high, and for the second year in a row, the construction industry leads the nation in insolvencies. ASIC data shows that in the last financial year, there were 2,213 construction companies entering insolvency. As of March this year, we've already hit just under 2,000. Housing supply cannot be increased without looking at the builders of houses, the construction sector. According to the Master Builders Association analysis of ABS producer price indices, the cost of building and construction output has increased by 40% since the pandemic, 40%. At the end of 2022, the Productivity Commission recommended that the government have an independent review of the construction sector and its regulations, including the National Construction Code. Labor has done nothing with the PC's advice and has let the construction cost spiral. The Master Builders Association's analysis of lending data for land and house purchases says that on average, the building costs make up 62% of our purchase price and the cost of land make up the remaining 38%. Building costs don't only include the material and labour needed to build a house, but also intermediate services. These services, which include legal and conveyancing services, don't actually contribute to the actual completion of the house, but are required by regulation. So in other words, taxes and regulation costs account for almost half the cost of building a house in this country. And to date, there's been no attempt in the last 2 years to assess these costs properly. It is a hive of vested interests, which Labor doesn't want to touch. For example, why not include the e-conveyancing system in the new competition reforms? Reports indicate that a $20 million benefit would accrue from collapsing this monopoly. At the same time, net migration has reached a record high. In the year to September 2023, the ABS measured net migration at 548,000, while only 170,000 new houses were built. This is a ratio of one house for every 3.2 migrants. Worse than the 2.6 ratio of migrants to housing at the end of the Chifley government that I referred to before. Compare this with the historic peak of houses built, 216,000, under the coalition in 2016-17, with a net migration figure that year of 262,000. This was a ratio of 1.2, much closer to parity. With only an additional 67,000 houses being approved since September 2023, Labor is placing unnecessary strain on the housing market. Workforce and skills shortages, though, are critical here. With home builders struggling to compete for labour in a large infrastructure projects around Australia, Labor's done nothing to encourage more people to gain the trade skills they need. And within the skilled migration envelope, Labor has made it harder for construction companies to bring in skilled temporary construction workers. In particular, Labor's judgment to exclude construction workers from the core skills temporary migration stream has made it harder for chronic skills shortages in the construction industry to be filled by skilled migrants. As a result, the Grattan Institute recently said migrants who arrived in Australia less than 5 years ago account for just 2.8% of construction workers, but account for 4.4% of all workers in Australia. By reprioritising construction skills within the core skills temporary migration scheme, temporary workforce bottlenecks could be erased while we train a bigger domestic workforce without adding to overall housing demand by bringing in more migrants. This would help to lower the cost of building a new house. But I wonder whether the inflated costs of construction actually suit Labor's official family of the CFMEU and CBUS. So what else has Labor done? They promised to establish a National Housing Supply and Affordability Council. The Federal Minister, Julie Collins, established this in December 2022. The body didn't meet until February this year. And then there's Labor's Help to Buy scheme, which is stalled in the Senate thanks to the Coalition and the Greens. This is not a home ownership policy, this is a home nationalisation policy. This shared equity scheme is totally underwhelming. It will be available to a mere 10,000 households per year and costs the Commonwealth $5.5 billion, whilst the government retains a 40% equity in the home. Lots of words, no action. On supply, which is the key component of the solution, we haven't built enough houses. Labor's housing supply targets have already failed. At the current rate, we'll be more than 200,000 houses short of their housing supply targets. And when the Commonwealth has so few levers to pull, it must be so careful with making pledges and with its rhetoric, which is why the failure, the clear failure on the 1.2 million is so disappointing. Of course, the state and local governments play a key role here in housing. Planning and zoning must be carefully scrutinised to increase supply. There are limited levers here for the Commonwealth. The most recent report from the Productivity Commission encouraged the states to revise their planning laws to ensure that development wasn't restricted. But building approvals are at their lowest level in 12 years. I think that there's a point here to make here around the loss of confidence in the construction industry because of the lack of action from government on moving forward with these issues. Here in New South Wales, the primary planning instrument, the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, reads more like a NIMBY Bible as opposed to a planning instrument. A 2018 RBA report showed that zoning restrictions added almost $500,000 to the cost of an average house in Sydney compared to just $150,000 in Brisbane. And the economist Peter Tulip has showed the huge benefit that has accrued to Auckland after Auckland removed medium density zoning, and that increased the rate of house building, but also cut the cost of construction. Here in New South Wales, even the smallest reforms have made a big difference. The abolition of the restrictions on granny flats has made a big difference, but we've got to be careful that we don't end up cutting our nose to spite our face here. So with local government, which is at the apex here of home ownership, recently I visited the Liverpool local council area where that LGA is going to waive the costs, some of the costs for developers. They will effectively cut costs, cut taxes to drive new housing development. And that is exactly what is needed. So when states make laws or make regulations which make it harder to increase supply, they should be penalised. One example would be the recent planning direction in New South Wales to limit the use of caravans and movable houses on private dwellings. Such a bureaucratic measure will do nothing to increase supply. In fact, it will do the reverse. It just removes market choice. So at a minimum, we need to look at how we can make the states accountable when they make decisions that constrain supply. On to tax, we understand that boosting home ownership can't be achieved with a single policy. The problem with much of the debate on tax on housing is that there's an assumption that a single policy change will solve the issue. Many have tried to falsely attribute the housing crisis to tax policies, including negative gearing and capital gains tax. Indeed, Senators Lambie and Pocock just this week have recently joined the Greens to promote such changes through a big media campaign. But if we abolish negative gearing tomorrow, it would have a minuscule impact on house prices. Peter Tulip, the CIS economist, has said, quote, negative gearing and capital gains discounts are estimated to boost house prices of between 1% and 4%, whilst having a smaller effect on rents, end quote. So while the Greens and the Labor Party continue with their class warfare arguments, they ignore the key stats. The ATO data tells us that more than 70% of the investors in the housing market own just one property. 70% own just one property. These people are providing supply into a market which is severely constrained. Minister Julie Collins' housing report on corporate ownership complains and says, and I quote, that the dominance in the residential market of individual landlords is a barrier to institutional ownership. I'm not sure what world they're living in. The philosophical hinge point is now between mums and dads on one side and major super funds and foreign fund managers on the other. Why would we want to displace mums and dads with enormous institutions? In any event, I see no good case for shocking the supply side of the market with a tax tweak, which the economists say would have a minor impact on prices. So on the demand side, I want to make the point to you that the simplest demand side reform we could make is to allow Australians to use their own super to get into the housing market and to stay in their own home. It's absurd that super funds can invest in residential property, but you're unable to use your own super for your own home. Our policy from the last election was a good start, and the Senate report, which I'm currently working on, will produce options to allow Australians to make their own judgments, more of their own judgments, to maximise first home ownership and to hasten home ownership. Next week, the Senate will hand down its first report on super for housing. It will present ideas on how we can improve the coalition's policy from the last election. The most common attack I hear is that we want Australians to raid their super. I think it's quite ironic, given that Labor's HAF policy is primarily designed for big super to raid the housing market. But this attack is usually followed by a criticism that opening up super will make Australians more reliant on the aged pension. What these arguments neglect is that home ownership is the vital form of saving for the future. It is the vital form of saving for the future. And what's more, super has failed to deliver what Paul Keating promised, but it hasn't failed to feather the nests of big unions and big financial institutions. In short, super has not and will never replace the age pension. That will never happen. The 2023 Intergenerational Report projects that expenditure on the age pension would fall from 2.3% in 2022-23 to 2% in 2062-2063. Whilst this may appear on the face to be a helpful statistic to the super boosters, a majority of Australians are still projected to be receiving a pension or other income support payment by 2062-63. So the IGR projects a decrease in the number of pension recipients of just 15% in the 40-year period between 2022 and 2062. 15%. So after 70 years of compulsory super, most of us will still be on the age pension. Combined with this shocking trajectory for home ownership, it is a massive failure of public policy, perhaps the biggest failure of Australia's public policy. For many Australians, their super balance is their biggest pool of capital. Denying young Australians to this capital for their own home is a cruel, self-interested proposition from Labor and Big Super. For example, according to the ATO, the average super balance of a millennial in their late 30s is $80,000. It is mean and unjust to deny people access to this deposit, which, apart from having access to the bank of mum and dad, if they're lucky enough to have that, may be their only chance of getting onto the deposit ladder, which is so hard to get onto. The second point I want to make about the criticism of the super policy is that it would be inflationary and it would push up house prices further. This is coupled with the notion that returns on super are worth more than the value of a house. Both of these points fall over because they're made without accounting for key consideration and inputs. The first of those is that super for housing would be inflationary, has been made with reference to previous first home buyer schemes. The economist Cameron Murray debunks his point by highlighting that without an end date in the scheme, there won't be a rush of people to access the scheme. And he says, quote, "So I think the price effect is probably small and definitely temporary, and the debate, we don't get that subtlety." The housing economist again, Peter Tulip, says, and I quote, "It seems implausible that the inflationary effect would be anywhere near that big. We have had the experience of financial assistance to first home buyers, and that's had a very big effect on lending to those people, but it hasn't had a very big effect on house prices." The Grattan Institute's Brendan Coates said the scare campaign on increased prices by the Super Members Council were sensationalist, and he said, "And that does seem excessive, given we're talking about a $10 trillion market, and the additional money made available out of super, depending on how it's designed, is going to be a small share of that in additional demand." Secondly, the argument that the returns from super will be worth more than the home's value fails to consider the aspiring homeowner's position today. Whilst aspiring homeowners are saving to enter the market, they are more than likely renting a property on the private market. Recently, independent actuaries Michael Rice AO and Jonathan Nun modelled cameos comparing the financial position of the prospective 35-year-old homeowner who used their super to buy a home with the position that if they continue to rent until age 60. The cameo concludes that the 35-year-old who uses their super for a 20% deposit on a unit valued $800K after 30 years, the value of that equity in the unit is worth $1.2 million in today's dollars. Compare this to keeping it in super, it would grow to just $319,000. $1.2 million, $300,000. The massive difference is because property is a highly geared investment. Rental payments are a pure expense. Mortgage payments build equity. Rent rises with inflation while the mortgage's real cost shrinks over time. So using super for a home deposit offers significantly better financial outcomes. But Labor and their favourite vested interests are working overtime to try and discredit this policy. This closed-minded ideological approach and the assumption that super is the only vehicle for retirement clearly damages home ownership prospects for younger Australians. And that is why the Coalition supports super for housing. So to conclude, Labor has adopted a corporate housing policy because it has given up on individual home ownership. Labor has lazy solutions, but they are solutions which snugly fit the contemporary Labor outlook where big institutions rule the roost. These are the solutions that will kill the Australian dream. We are the only party that still believes in the Australian dream, which is where the individual, not the institutions, is at the centre of our focus. And we are the only party that is fighting for the Australian dream because this has always been a Liberal dream and something that Labor has never fully signed up for.
So many thanks to our speaker for a stimulating discussion. Okay, so we now come to questions and discussion. If you just come back here and talk to the back of the room. Just taking on your point about regulation, you also mentioned Robert Menzies. As you know, there was another big housing crisis at the end of the Second World War. A lot of growing up in Melbourne, I mean, people lived in a camp on the edge of the city and near Royal Park, near the zoo, near the Carlton football ground. It was full of people. But that was overcome, and I guess the main reason, looking back on it, was, and you've made this point, there was little regulation in the late 40s, early 50s, either at the state level and certainly not at the federal level, and people could also build their own houses without too much supervision, and not many people died doing it. I mean, they did it safely, but they did it cheaply. So how can we, now we're flooded, I mean, the Western world's flooded with regulation, so what can any federal government do to wind that back at the federal level?
Well, I mean, the first point is that it is a good starting point, at least, to recognise that we have been here before, right? We did have very high levels of migration. Menzies inherited a position where there were not a lot of new houses being built, and ultimately he was able to work through that because he was able to unleash the market to do a lot of that work. He also built a lot of public housing, right? I mean, the idea of public housing, governments building public housing now is not really a reality. I mean, governments invest heavily in what we now call social housing, which is a bit like super, that we sort of outsource this in a quasi way to the market. I'm not sure how effective that is actually. But now if you look at the cost of regulation on the construction sector, and hopefully this point has come through, that, I mean, Labor is not unhappy with inflated construction costs. I mean, this is a government that benefits greatly from feathering the nests of their favourite fellow travellers. I don't think that they're particularly unhappy with that. And then there's this huge cost of regulation in the lending space that I don't think people can easily get enough finance. I mean, for example, we have prudential standards, which the Prudential Regulation Authority has to look after, and they have responsible lending obligations in them. And then you have responsible lending laws, which ASIC has to look after. So, I mean, every time you try and get a loan, I mean, anyone who's tried to get a loan recently would know this, that we are bound in reams and reams of red tape. So if we want to unleash the animal spirits of the economy and we believe in individual ownership and we want to stop demonising private developers and we want to see that happen, we're going to have a serious conversation about deregulation and getting rid of some laws which are holding the market back.
Senator, thank you. I might agree with some of your sentiments and statistics, but supply and demand, doesn't matter whether it's housing or chocolate or toothpaste,
Yes.
how does one increase supply substantially with all the infrastructure needed without choking already saturated communities, be it in Sydney or regional South Wales, whatever?
Well, if you look at Sydney, for example, and I'll make this point because we're at the Sydney Institute, there are parts of Sydney which are very heavily densely populated, and you can look at the data where you can see high levels of high density living, the lower North Shore, the eastern suburbs, for example, the inner west. Then there are parts of Sydney where there is very low levels of density, and I think that that's where some of the heavy lifting can be done. But it's got to be done in partnership with those LGAs. And effectively, you need to have councils that want to build more houses. And I've spent a lot of time in the last little while in southwest Sydney, Camden, Campbelltown. I've been to Liverpool. Those are all local government areas that they want to build houses, right? And so yesterday someone was saying to me, I want to build 500 houses here in the Liverpool LGA. But I can't do it because the water board saying it's going to take 2 years to get the water on. So there's a lot of moving parts here, and I think we've got to be laser-like in our focus on holding any of these institutions to account who are holding back. I mean, I frankly think that's actually on Chris Minns. I mean, if the water board is holding back the development of new houses and he's apparently in favour of more houses, then that's on him. So I think that there are great opportunities to get more density. It's got to be around the appropriate places. I think arbitrary policies won't work, but I think you can achieve it, but you've got to have good local governments who are prepared to do it, and that be backed in by the state that needs to provide the infrastructure. Now, the Commonwealth comes in with money. The only thing we do is we provide our chequebook, and I think that the Labor government's policy here of paying the states to build houses is already a failure. I mean, it's not happening. So I think we would have to go further and look to coerce the states.
Yeah. If you look at other countries, we tend to think that we live in a society where existing capital cities are somehow considered to be the only places in which you get real development.
Yeah.
If you look in, for instance, at the US, the otherwise sensible Treasurer of New South Wales made a statement recently about some poor theoretical guy, an accountant with a suit and a briefcase, unable to live in San Francisco. Particularly stupid because the guy wouldn't be in San Francisco by now. He'd have moved to Phoenix or North Carolina or somewhere else. Can we look at an appropriate way of having, particularly in times of remote working, of having truly appropriate decentralisation? And I don't mean people putting in the arid middle.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, decentralisation is, of course, a worthy objective, but I mean, for whatever image we may have of ourselves as Australians, we're a highly urbanised population. People want to live in Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane. I think we should always have policies to promote decentralisation, but the reality is people want to live in the cities. So there's a limit to what governments can do. I mean, we can put government departments in Dubbo and other things like that, which has been tried. But I think that the reality is that people want to live in the big cities.
You mentioned, you gave us a lot of information about building approvals, completions and so on.
Yeah.
Against demand, which is very high.
Yeah.
You didn't mention the number of houses we knocked down. And in Sydney, we probably knocked down, we don't measure it, we probably knocked down about 1,000 houses a month. Now, you'd strengthen your case if you adjusted your supply for the knockdowns, because that makes quite a big hole in the aspirational completions, which a lot of people talk about.
Well, it depends what you're replacing it with as well. I mean, there's obviously a debate to be had at the council level about what sort of local provisions they have for, if you knock down an old house, what are you supposed to replace it with? I mean, I know that in some LGAs, people buy 3 houses to build 1 house, which is sort of going in the wrong direction. But you also have to understand that we live in a society where we want to allow people to have some flexibility with their own things that they own. I mean, that's sort of the nature of a capitalist economy. But we are very aggressively needing to build more houses, so we need to keep an eye on that.
I've got a question from Canberra, which is the government was a direct investor in the housing market in the ACT from 1950 to 75 and on-sold homes in Canberra for cost price. And he says, and it's Dennis from Canberra, why can't we go back to at least the government developing land at cost price? So I guess he's talking about local government.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, as I said, I mean, there'll be a clear choice at the election between the Liberal Party, the coalition that believes in individuals owning houses. That clearly requires the private economy, developers and the like, to be in the vanguard of that. Then you've got the Labor Party that wants institutions to own the houses. Then you've got the Greens who want the government property developer to build the houses and then rent them out. So that's a very clear choice. Personally, I think that we may get better value in building our own public housing rather than giving it all to the community housing providers. That may improve the accountability because we're effectively outsourcing it, but still providing it as a government service. I mean, there will always be a need for some people to live in socialised housing or government housing, and that's entirely reasonable. So we're going to provide it anyway. I wonder whether there are better ways to do it than to outsource it all to the community housing providers, because, as I say, if you look at the superannuation system, I don't think it's been very successful as an outsourced pension scheme. So sometimes if there are public services, and I believe in the market, and I think the market has to solve this, government's got to get out of the way, but there are some things that government provides in a liberal society like ours, and maybe it's better that the government provides it itself rather than outsourcing it.
Thank you for taking my question. I just want to ask a question specifically about the super fund to buy the house.
Yeah.
First of all, like the young people, like you look at their super balance is very low. I mean, you're talking about you have to come up $100,000 deposit. And second, those assets, if you own the houses, they're not generating any income. And then say if you buy an apartment, you need like $20,000 to just pay the body corp, everything. So, and also you have to pay the mortgage. So you have to increase the contribution to pay that cost.
Well, I mean, if you want to buy an entry-level flat in a town like Sydney, you're going to need more than $100,000 to get into the market. So if the average 38-year-old has $80,000 in their super, absent the bank of mum and dad, that's their only shot of getting into the market. So denying them access to that, I think, is very strange. I think we're in a very contorted position on that, particularly given the fact that your super can invest in any house except your own. So I think there's a good case for doing it. As I said, the actuaries have said that over the long term, you're better off owning your own house in your super fund anyway. And look, frankly, I think anyone who's relying on their super to be their sole retirement plan, I think should have their head read. I mean, it's a very paternalistic idea. And I think most Australians are smarter than relying on the idea that they're going to get some other guy to manage their money for 40 years. So I think we've got to be stronger with our conviction that this is actually the people's money. And right now we're trying to solve a housing crisis. That's not a silver bullet. You can't solve it without the supply piece. But certainly I think there's a sweet spot in there, particularly I think for couples in their 30s who want to get into the Sydney or Melbourne property market. This is their way in. They have no other way in.
Hi, Andrew. It's all good thinking, but having a place down the coast where a lot of tradies live, what I find interesting is that people who live out of Sydney and live in these idyllic places and can find work, their kids have got houses. They own houses. Why isn't there more take-up on encouraging people to think regionally? We're doing a lot of work from home now. Why can't the government be involving people in thinking outside the square and not constantly thinking they have to buy in a place that's so far out of Campbelltown they could probably get to Canberra quicker than they can get to CBD Sydney? I mean, we're just stretching it out into the country from Sydney. Why not go down the coast and buy something near, Nowra or a bit further down, and where you could work from home?
Well, I mean, thanks, Anne. As you know, we don't tell people where to live, but certainly, and I grew up in the bush myself, I think it's a good option for people. But I mean, if people want to live in the city, we can't stop them from living in the city. But the endless sprawl is not the answer. So that's why I think it is the right policy for the suburbs to have more density where they can. But if people can live in the bush, then it's going to be more accessible. But I think it's happening anyway. I mean, basically, if you look at a lot of the data for people aged between 30 and 40, they're giving up on Sydney. Yeah. And it's happening anyway.
Yeah, that's my point. There are lots of articles about people going to places north of Brisbane, going down the coast, but a little bit more concentration by governments on encouraging people to think about it might be better than just telling people they can get a flat near Sydney.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a really big problem for us in Sydney because we're going to lose brains and skills we need here in Australia's global city, and people are not going to be here because it's unaffordable. So there is an Australian housing crisis, and then there is a Sydney housing crisis.
I've got a question here from a hard-headed economist in Sydney. You have quoted an extensive range of statistics and analysts. You noted that near half the cost of a new home is tax and regulation. Perhaps a third is tax, including GST, stamp duty and land tax. What will a coalition government do, particularly on the tax piece, and noting that tax cuts require spending cuts?
Well, I think that if you think about what the Commonwealth Government does, we do some tax policy here. We do banking and lending policy. We do superannuation. But we also have the grants. So we give states money for different things. We have as the economists call it, the vertical fiscal imbalance, where we collect most of the revenue and then we give a lot of it to the states. So we could look at, as I said, to coerce the states to build infrastructure. And the example I have in mind is, well, we know that there are local government areas in Liverpool and Camden that we know that they want to do the right thing. They want to build more homes. And so we want the state to build a road or build a sewage system or build something. And so we could hold that over the states. On the tax piece itself, I mean, there are different models you could look at. I mean, in the US, they have a system where they allow first home buyers to deduct interest costs. They have other models in different countries. I mean, these are all things that are worth examining.
Just on superannuation, I know it's not specifically your area, but as you know, it was introduced essentially by Paul Keating in the final years of the Labor government. But it was continued. It wasn't increased rapidly, but it was continued by the Howard government and then, of course, again by the coalition government over the last 9 years. So what are you saying about the general policy on superannuation, apart from whether it increases or not? in relation to what you've said tonight. I mean, does the superannuation system remain in place or does it get replaced?
Look, I think that the Liberal Party opposed compulsory super, and you can go back through the annals of the Senate and you can read Richard Olson's speeches and the like, and it's very clear that that was our position. I think it was a mistake by the Howard government to allow it to get up to the point that it did, but it is what it is. My main concern with it is that it's very paternalistic. It assumes that people are too stupid to work out their own arrangements. And I think it is very, very paternalistic to say, particularly to younger people who are in their 20s, well, that money, and now it's 11%, and combined with the HEX debt and everything else, that money's going away for 40 years, forget about it. I think it's a big incursion into people's personal liberties. And I have personally had reservations about it for many years. I don't think anyone is going to advocate the abolition of the system, but I do think that there is a very strong case for it to be liberalised and for people to make their own judgments about what they want to use their own money for. So I think if people want to use it, fine, but I do think there's a strong case for people to make other judgments like they do in Singapore, where they can use it for a home, use it for insurance, use it for health purposes. I think there's a very strong case to be made there.
I've got another question from someone on the Zoom and she wonders, what the heck are you doing voting with the Greens in the Senate? I mean, is that a good policy, she asked, for the Liberal Party and the National Party to be pursuing, even if it's only on one current issue?
Well, we don't think that it's a good policy to have Mr Albanese sitting around the dinner table with people in a house as a 40% owner of the house. I mean, I don't think he's the guy you want to hang out with on Christmas Day. And so we are against the we are against the Help to Buy scheme. We think it's wrong. We think it gives up on home ownership. And furthermore, the states all have these schemes and no one uses them. So I think it is a terrible policy. The fact that the Greens are against it is a unusual, perhaps, development. They have their own reasons. If you read the Senate report, you can read that the Greens have their own reasons for saying it's a bad idea, but our position is clear, and I don't think it'll be legislated, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's a waste of $5.5 billion.
Thanks for your comments this evening. You've talked extensively about 20 to 30-year-olds and first home buyers. I was wondering if you'd comment on how you see your solution applying to some of the other demographic groups at risk of homelessness and finding it hard to get into the market. For example, single older women who are increasingly at risk of homelessness.
So we have a policy which allows people to access their super that Peter has already announced, which is squarely designed to help that key demographic. But again, I mean, I think there are other things that we can do to try and get them into the home ownership market at a more mature age, again, which comes back to super, comes back to lending. I mean, one of the major issues here is that people can't get a loan. And they can't look at their future cash flows as part of the equation that a bank will look at. And so I think that if you look at getting the super for the deposit hurdle that everyone needs, I mean, these are not solutions just for young people. They're also solutions for more mature people. And then you need to look at the lending standards to make sure that a reasonable cash flow analysis can be made. And furthermore, I should make this point that if the bank wants to take on the risk, they should be able to. Now we've got a situation where the banks are too afraid to take on any risk at all because of the enormous regulatory burden. So I think we're in a dreadful position. And I would also say that I'm not sure that this community housing model is the right way to go. I mean, I think we want to have a system where, this is what I imagine in my head, right, where you effectively have the government housing provider, which would be working in place of the community housing provider, perhaps, with the same amount of taxpayer funding, and you'd haul them before Senate estimates and you'd say, well, how are you going building houses? How are you going with maintaining the houses? I mean, that sort of accountability is not available to us with the community housing providers, even though these are the massive beneficiaries of the taxpayer support. And the other fly in the ointment here is, of course, that the government scheme is the Housing Australia Future Fund is designed in a way that it puts the community housing providers in the box seat to get a lot of the taxpayer funds, and they then work with the super funds. So this is another way of entrenching the super funds into the middle of every road with Labor leads back to institutions owning the shop. So those are a couple of ideas I've got.
Just the final question from... Sorry? Okay.
Mr. Bragg, great speech, thanks. You've mentioned Singapore a number of times.
Yeah.
Lee Kuan Yew appears to pick up the idea of the property owning democracy while in England, and he's then taken it further than we have, 90% plus home ownership. There seem to be two observations on that. One is that they intervene in the lending more for mortgages, so young families have a lower rate. Have you considered that? Especially where investors on their second and third property can borrow off the previous ones, if we're about individual ownership, which you'll understand. We have one advantage over Singapore, which I think should be considered. We're more land in Australia per person, both aggregate and arable, than anywhere else in the world. Will you open that up using land value capture?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, if I'd had a buck for every time someone said Singapore is the solution to all the economic problems, I'd be very wealthy. One of the things about Singapore is it may be democracy, but it's a different form of democracy to Australia, and so they can move more quickly. On the prudential capital requirements piece, that is something that we will look at, whether there's a way to change the capital weights to... We want to tilt the scales in favour of first home buyers, right? If there's a way to safely do that whilst ensuring the banks are unquestionably strong, then we will do that. Land value capture, not something I've looked at right now, but I think the lending piece is critical. And as I said in my remarks, in Singapore, their equivalent body takes into account the broader factors of the impacts of capital adequacy policy and lending policy.
Just a final question, because we've had one on homelessness, we've had others. What about renters? I mean, how, in terms of your package today, you've covered the issues, but what specifically would you say about the rent problem? I know it's not essentially a Commonwealth responsibility, but Commonwealth's got something to do with it.
Well, again, it comes back to supply. I mean, the reason that rents are so high is because there's nowhere to live in Sydney. It's expensive. Melbourne has similar issues, so does Brisbane. And effectively, we will need to see rents come down when you have more supply. But I have to say, I hope the data wasn't too boring, but it's worth just unpacking it, that the trajectory we're on now with construction is very bad. I mean, I think this is going to get worse before it gets better. And so, unfortunately, we do need to just do everything we can to build like buggery, to get those houses out there, because that's the best thing we can do for everyone, whether you want to have a mortgage or whether you're happy renting.
Many thanks.
Okay.
Well, there are a lot of people here tonight, and we're right on time, so I'll be very brief. Many thanks to Senator Andrew Bragg for giving us a kind of simulating talk today, but also with a great deal of data in your paper, which we can go back and read when it's published later on in the Sydney papers. No doubt you'll have it up on your website as well. So well done tonight, and we'll have you back sometime in the future. Thank you.